Well, I'm super excited to introduce Kate Mothes, who's the founder and creator of Young Space, and also this year's all-senior show, Juror. I was wondering if you could start by maybe talking a little bit about Young Space specifically and kind of the how and why of, like how you started it and why.
Yeah, definitely. It was kind of a roundabout sort of thing, actually. I was in grad school. This was 2014, so a few years ago, but I was in Scotland at the time doing a master's in art history. And my undergrad was in art history as well. And I grew up like my dad was a painter, and I was very much kind of always involved in sort of art related activities, but wasn't sure what I wanted to do with it necessarily. And so I discovered I really liked art history classes. But then I think by the time I got to grad school, I was starting to feel sort of funneled into academia. And I wasn't quite sure if, the next step would have been a PhD. Do I want to be kind of this rolling thing and figuring out what the heck I was actually interested in. And so one thing I ended up doing while I was kind of in my last few months of my master's degree was volunteer at an artist-run space called Interview Room 11. And it was run by 3 artists and a curator who were just putting together their own shows all the time downtown in this old office block. It was really ugly, like just the kind of they could do whatever they wanted in this space. And I think it was the first time where I just thought like, oh my God, you can just do this yourself. Like you can just invite your friends and put on these amazing critical shows, and they were getting reviews written. And so that was the first time I think I started looking at art and finding maybe elements of contemporary art that I responded to in a specific way. And through that, I ended up creating Young Space, which I still don't totally remember where the name came from. I think it just popped into my head and then it wouldn't go away. So I started a blog, essentially. It was just a little like blog spot thing to kind of talk about work that I was looking at that I really enjoyed, but wanted to talk about it differently than if I was writing a research paper, for example. And I love researching and I love writing kind of academic research as well, but it was kind of a nice dialogue to have. And so I did that just kind of for a learning experience for myself to sort of figure out how to look at what I was liking and kind of how to talk about it. And then probably a year later or so, I started an Instagram account for it, not really thinking. I just was like, oh, well, I'll share some paintings on Instagram. And that was when, really unexpectedly, I guess, it just really started to resonate with other people who were also looking, painting on Instagram, just screens in general. It was just kind of a perfect storm of, people trying to research artists, like younger artists getting their work out there on a platform that's free. And so that combined with the blog, it just sort of grew into kind of a submission-based thing. I started to put together exhibitions, and it's all kind of I like to look at it as kind of a call and response sort of thing. I'll, be like, I'll have an idea, I'll give it a shot. If people respond to it, I'll think it's great, and we'll keep just kind of tweaking it as I go. So it's been constantly a work in progress, but still going. So that's good.
Yeah,
So
and
yeah,
going and growing too.
yeah.
What year would you say it moved to Instagram?
I think it was on Instagram probably starting in like 2015, 2016, but I would say it was like really late, like 2016, early 2017, that it started to kind of take off. There was definitely a weird moment where it's like, who knows? It could have just been like one random account that other people followed already, shared it, and then suddenly I was like, what is this going on here? But I think at the time I was still kind of like, whatever, it's Instagram. Like I didn't really put much stock in the fact that, it's a social media platform. I was still, kind of in academia mode and was like, no, it's got to be kind of serious, and I can't be doing my work through a social media platform. But I just realized that really quickly that was the kind of nexus for kind of any connection that was going to happen. It was so social and so easy to kind of find, gallerists and artists and curators all in one spot. So I just was like, okay, I got to put my attention on that quite a bit. So it just kind of grew really quickly within a pretty short period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I was gonna say, I've been following Young Space for years, and even when I reached out to you, I was like, I know we've emailed before, and it was like 2017, so I know I've been following it that long, and I've definitely discovered artists through Young Space, like Daisy Paris, a few
Definitely.
others, like I've shown Daisy's work at Montserrat a few years ago, and I'm like almost 100% sure I found her on Young Space, and now she's like in Elle magazine, and like
Yeah.
the power of the internet is amazing, that we can show her that you promoted her, that she's in this big magazine, that she's like painting every day. So I was super inspired by the fact that you really focused on emerging artists and artists who are getting their BFAs and MFAs.
Definitely. I think that that's been, to me, kind of this really interesting, which, I didn't know at the beginning. I think I was just always really, and still am, really intrigued by the kind of early career period in any artist's career, because there's just this kind of figuring it out naturally that happens when you're trying to kind of just establish what it is that you are interested in and doing in some way. And I love just kind of the experimental quality and the kind of, I'm like, I don't know, we're just going to have to give this a shot kind of idea. And that's maybe because that's how I view my projects as well. And I like there to be that energy in there. So I naturally gravitate toward artists who are kind of just figuring it out. And so then what's also really rewarding, though, is that as many artists that I feature and kind of keep in touch with, they become a bit more established and they start to get gallery representation and a couple museum shows or publications, and then it circles back around and they still support Young Space, so it builds in, and then I get more younger artists more interested. So it's a really great cycle the longer it's been running.
Yeah, that's actually really amazing advice.
Yeah.
So jumping into some of the questions, I know you kind of touched on this. I think you said there you had this feeling of like, I don't want to do what I do on Instagram, on the social media platform. And we got a question about sort of the stigma, like, is curating online looked down on at all?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually, and maybe really interestingly relevant at the moment because sort of everyone has to be online. So maybe I'm kind of curious how this may even change after we've sort of settled into this idea of what a virtual platform or exhibition might be like. But I would definitely say that, like, over the last few years, there's already been, there's been virtual exhibitions in some way. There have been institutions who have put their at least their kind of exhibition, documents and images online, even if you can't, it's not a physical experience, but you can still get the general idea of what's going on. Google Arts and Culture doing their street views of museums and that kind of thing. And there's been a lot of artist-run spaces that have done kind of virtual platforms showing kind of internet art and kind of interesting experimental stuff for a while. But I think the idea that wrapped up with curating is an interesting conversation, because the definition of curating itself has changed and become something different within the last couple decades as well. Just the idea of a curator not necessarily taking care of specifically just a museum collection or a gallery collection. A curator is sort of morphed into a person who can kind of do a number of different creative things, and sometimes the definition of that just depends on the person. So I think maybe generally there's a little bit of I don't know, I don't want to say necessarily misunderstanding, but just sort of it's become a little bit convoluted as in terms of what a curator actually does. There's just less understanding. It's not quite as clear cut as maybe it used to be defined as. So with that, and I think maybe with the internet being just, it just literally is everything. And it's really hard to kind of parse out like who's doing so-called serious work or who's in my corner with me, I think it's easy to kind of get a little hung up on, I get a little cynical sometimes too, because I'm like, is that person is this Instagram account, is it a person? Are they doing another project, or is this just an Instagram account with 300,000 followers? Like, is there maybe substance to it, I guess, is maybe a question. And that's something that I ask myself, is just kind of it's one thing to use these tools as a way to get work out there and make sure that people can find that information, but is there more to it? Is there an actual meaning to what you're trying to present? That's where I think it does still have some value. And that's why I think that like virtual exhibitions can in some way be helpful. They're never going to totally replace a physical exhibition, but they do have kind of a role to play. And I think that curators are kind of in an interesting position as intermediaries, maybe going between galleries or institutions and artists and connecting these dots in interesting ways. So it is a challenge. I do sometimes get artists every once in a while who are like, this doesn't take any work. You don't need to like ship paintings or hang anything up on the wall. But I think the work is just a little different. It just has a different flavor. So
yeah. I mean, you're kind of already talking about this, but we got a few people asking about that, about, what are the pros and cons of curating online for, someone that's been doing it for so long, or, maybe for a student who's interested in doing it, like what should I look out for?
Yeah. I think that it can be kind of hard to tell, but I think one good way, because a lot of us are connected online so far, quite well, especially on Instagram, is that like if you know others, good friends of yours, your peers, but also if there's other galleries that you really admire or programs, museums, you can kind of start to find connections pretty easily on social media because it does tell you who's following who. So even just from a very beginning standpoint, I'm just trying to kind of learn what's out there and who's out there. You can kind of figure out who's maybe in your circle, if you want to call it that, by finding these connections. And it's fairly easy to find someone to just ask, like, do you know anything about this, this gallery or this project? And I get questions like that all the time, and I ask other friends too. I mean, there was an example a couple weeks ago. It was really, just to me, it was out of the blue. I didn't have any connection to this previously, but there was an art fair in Moscow that was launching a new satellite project. And they were like, we would love to talk to you about curating this project. And I thought, okay, this sounds interesting, but I just had no context for who the gallery was that was reaching out to me, what this fair was. I've never been to this art fair in Moscow. So I had to research every little bit of it. And I still just kind of felt funny about it just because I didn't have my own personal connection to it. And I think I just realized that so much of it comes down to kind of just what those natural connections are that you already have. And it just ultimately adds, and not that they're not doing anything that is untoward or whatever, but that I just needed to do extra research and, could figure out if they were legit or if they were, kind of working with other people that I knew. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, they are working with some people I know. I can just ask them and then we can go from there with the conversation. So it's just been really helpful, I think, to kind of already have that connectivity and then be able to ask questions really easily about whether it's kind of worthwhile working with somebody. Or, if it is just ends up being an Instagram account and they want to show your work, then you find that out. So, yeah.
Yeah, totally. It's like the access to it all is easier to research, to actually like visually see the network, to be able to click a button and be like, oh, okay, this is like totally fine because, my people know them.
Definitely. Yeah.
We have a question about, and actually you sort of touched on this too. What would you suggest to gain followers or supporters of social media or your online project?
I guess there's a few ways to do that, but I feel like the biggest is just in what it's called is social media, and I guess that's the thing. It's like, I am absolutely, like, I abhor the idea of networking in itself, like the idea of kind of business networking. It just makes me so anxious. So if I look at it more like I'm participating in a community of like-minded people, then it's much easier for me to make those connections. And that ultimately has always sort of led to the best. I want to say best because it's just more people who are in your interest group already. If you're talking about kind of getting followers on social media, you obviously want people who are really invested in what you're doing and potentially supporting you, and then you can talk to them. So it might be, people who would put together an exhibition. It might be other artists that down the road you can organize and you can bounce ideas off of each other. But if you're just getting followers for, I don't know, even where you would, kind of randomly, or there's bots that you can buy that'll give you followers. There's just that's not going to benefit you in any way other than just giving you a higher number. So it'll take longer, but I think just really emphasizing that connection and genuinely kind of, commenting and talking and like starting real conversations. It's literally networking, but you're just doing it through this Instagram type media. That's generally been the best practice I've found so far. And it's just kind of, it's the maybe tortoise versus the hare kind of situation. But yeah.
Yeah. So. We also got several questions about how you organize shows, like specifically, like, do you think of a concept or a theme first, or do you kind of gather a roster of artists? I know you typically, with Young Space, you typically do open calls.
Yeah.
Even with open calls specifically, do you kind of notice a theme, or do you feel really strongly towards specific artists to formulate a theme?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, because I think it varies so much on the nature of the project. Like the Young Space open calls, it's funny because Young Space is sort of, it's like a project, but it's also me. It's just me, really, and it's an umbrella for a lot of things. So the Young Space open calls are kind of a core thing that project does. And I've always been, I guess I'm a formalist at heart, honestly. Like if I'm really gonna just throw it out there, I love just looking at the work itself and then adding ideas to it to give it context afterward. I like just that initial line, color, what is this form that's showing, with this work? And that just gives me something to work with initially. So I'm not just naturally, I guess, a person who starts with an idea, a theme, or something literary that was in my mind that then I need to form things around. And it's partly maybe because I just kind of prefer to see what the artists think their best work is, what they want to show me. And so I don't like the idea of necessarily throwing a theme in there that can kind of cut a wedge into what their practice might be. If they want to show me their work, I don't want them to show me just one little segment of it that happens to fit what I want to do. I want to see what they're doing. And then, so the open calls tend to be very open in terms of what they're allowed to submit and apply with, but then through those submissions, that's where I kind of use my curatorial chops and try to develop the natural themes that emerge. And there always is. I mean, there's several, and there's big themes and small themes, and you can kind of formulate many different ideas. But that's what I find most interesting, is creating these really unexpected dialogues in between artworks that you might not necessarily think would go together, or artists who have never heard of each other before, and then creating connections that are new to them as well. But then on the flip side, if I'm curating a show for a gallery, for example, or a small museum, they might already have sort of a theme or some sort of overall program that they're trying to fit. So that gives me some parameters, and then I can kind of go select artworks and artists that I'd like to work with specifically for that idea. And that just allows me to work within a different framework, but it kind of just depends on what the project is. So it's kind of cool to bounce between those two different methods, honestly. So yeah.
Totally. I mean, that's another question, like, what else are you working on? Aside from Young Space, obviously you're jurying.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like you're doing some consulting work in the UK. So I'm so curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's definitely, I sort of feel like I'm kind of a jack of all art trades in a weird way. I'm pretty unconventional in a sense, because like I mentioned, I live in Wisconsin, and I'm not even in Milwaukee. I'm like 2 hours north of Milwaukee in a really tiny little mill town. And so that's maybe, essentially the magic of the internet, is that I can be, on a phone call with a gallery in Berlin in the morning consulting, and then, I'll travel for shows and do different things, but being really quite nomadic. And that, again, is also just kind of a little puzzle, I guess, that I'm piecing together. So the nucleus of it is Young Space, and then there's the open calls, and there's certain things that have a schedule, and I do them throughout the year. So there's some sort of structure that I build everything else around. But then just in my travels, I'm constantly going to other, galleries. I'll check out shows. I love going to spaces run by artists so that I can kind of talk with them and see what they're doing. I do studio visits all the time. So some of those conversations then end up leading to new projects down the line. So I usually try to schedule like an exhibition or two ahead within like the next, 9 months or a year. It's a little up in the air right now because no one knows when they're going to be able to open back up. So it's kind of weird. But, I like to do a lot of different things. I think I've just always been like that. I'm kind of a doer. So, you know, in my spare time, I'm like beating earrings, like doing other stuff, like painting rooms in my house and that kind of stuff. But I try to write a bit as well. I, you know, occasionally writing articles for other blogs, and there's been, I think, about 4 podcasts now too that I've appeared on. So there's kind of various other little projects and things that come up all the time. And that's just really exciting to just have a big kind of mixed pot of a lot of stuff happening at once.
Totally. I have to ask, like, you know, it sounds amazing for obvious reasons, like that you could be anywhere. That's like the biggest pro, right, of doing things online. It's like you can live anywhere in the world and sort of be present everywhere.
Yeah.
But why Wisconsin? Like, what drew you to Wisconsin?
It's a love-hate relationship because I grew up here. So yeah, yeah, my family's here. My parents are here. My sister and her family are here. So there's a bit of a home base. And honestly, to me, I guess, like, I have lived many other places. I was out in California for a while. I lived in the UK. I've been kind of back and forth in different parts of the Midwest. And I'm always trying to get out of here. And I think that that is kind of a funny thing that I've just within the last few years have started to finally maybe grasp a little bit more, is that this is why I do what I want to do, is that I've always wanted to get out. It's just this kind of small town Midwest thing. But strangely, it's also the actual wanting to get out, that constant searching, that's the reason that you're doing everything. So I think I always thought, oh, if I, you know, eventually move to New York, as you do, or you move to London, as you do, then when I get there, I'll have figured it out and I'll get my job and I'll be a professional curator or whatever it is, and then I'll have made it. But I think I just realized that I wasn't ever going to be the sort of person who just figured out the job and then was happy for the rest of my life. It's the searching and wanting to get out that's like really just this kind of constant push and pull and really fun. So I think I just gradually figured out that what I needed was kind of a little home base to bounce back to occasionally. But I'm typically in Wisconsin maybe like a third of the year, and I Airbnb out my apartment while I'm gone and then just bounce around for projects. And so I'll be in the UK for a few months. I'll go hang out in LA for a little while and just crash with friends or something, but doing projects and studio visits and trying to literally be all over the place as much as possible. But that's just something that I've kind of had to figure out as I go along. So.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask because I feel like we don't hear that narrative that often. The narrative is usually like, I went to New York and I made it happen, or and then with that, there's pressure. I think for a lot of the students here, it's almost like you feel obligated to go to New York, to go to LA. So it's like, you know, someone who's in Wisconsin, like, how are you staying inspired? How are you doing? How are you, you know, you created something really big and you didn't go to, you know, you're not in New York right now.
Right.
So I think that's really inspiring.
It's funny because you know, the ability to travel and to go to New York a few times a year if I want to, because it costs so much less to live in Wisconsin. I can afford to fly to New York for a weekend and go do what I want to do and have a really amazing time without having to worry about New York rental prices or, you know, trying to find a job there. And so I get to enjoy it kind of like a tourist, which is really great. But I think for the work that I'm doing as well, it's really, really important to maintain, I guess I kind of look at it as like a neutrality in a way, that I'm not really in any specific art scene. So I'm not, you know, feeling the kind of pressure to go to New York shows all the time, or Los Angeles or at London or wherever, because I think inevitably when you're in those places, that's going to be most of the information that you're getting. And that's where all your friends are going and checking things out. So to me, it's been really nice to be able to bounce into those places using the internet to find out what's going on in different places. And sort of, obviously, I wish I could be everywhere at once sometimes, but so do we all, you know. I think it's just nice that I can kind of get out of the noise of information and sort of parse out what I find really interesting, and then just bounce in for a little bit, come back, and then, you know, be in a place where it's not super exciting here in Wisconsin, but it's also very easy to be here. So it's definitely, you know, kind of a compromise, but it, you know, I think you just sort of figure out what works for you. And I think it's good. Like, I have lived in the city for a few years. It teaches you a lot, but I think, you know,
Yeah.
you kind of, you had mentioned Standard Projects, which my friend Claire runs, which is just about 20 minutes away from where I live right now. It's old village police station that she purchased. And she had been living in Brooklyn for 5 years and was working at like MoMA PS1 and has, you know, was a sculptor. But she was running into the same issue where she's like, I'm a sculptor. I have no ability in Brooklyn to afford a place to make the work that I want to make. And for, you know, a fraction of what she was paying on rent in her Brooklyn apartment, she went and bought an entire building in this village and has this huge studio and a space and a residency and this whole thing. And just, you know, but it's just kind of exchanging what it is you really want to do for literally where it is. And that was maybe for both of us, but myself as well, just kind of the biggest lesson to learn is how to balance what your goals are and then where you really need to be to do it.
Yeah, totally. Like asking yourself, like, who am I and what do I need? What do I want? And like setting aside that, you know, pressure and obligation to do certain things as artists. Like, and I wish we heard more from people like you. I recently talked with an artist who has a house in kind of the middle of nowhere in New Mexico, and it's like this huge studio to work on sculptures, and he's like, this just works for me. Like, it just works so much better than being in the city. So I want to, like, you know, be able to tell those stories to the students too. Like, you don't actually need to do, you know, X, Y, or Z.
Right, exactly. Yeah. You can definitely be aware without having to feel that pressure to just kind of full throttle go in. If you want to do that, that's awesome too. But like, doesn't necessarily have to fit for you if it's just not what you're into. So
yeah.
So Kevin, could I ask a question?
Sure. Yeah.
So I know. Hi, Kate.
Hi.
I'm one of the leaders of the seminar here.
Hi, it's nice to meet you.
The students might want to know, the question we always ask a visiting artist is, you know, what's the day job? And I know quite often the side hustle turns into the full-time job. So could you talk a little bit about that? How you put together the rent? The Airbnb sounds like a great idea.
Oh, right.
Yeah. But how do you put it together?
Yeah, that is such a good question, because I think that's really, really important as well, because there's, you know, I mean, the vast majority of people that I work with, other artists, they all have another day job as well. And we tend to just not want to talk about it because, you know, look at my art, that's important. But I do think it's really important. And I do, or I have until recently, unfortunately, I was working at a bookstore locally here in Wisconsin, which was something that I had done. Oh my gosh, it was like 10 years ago. It was right after my undergrad. I had moved back to home for a few years, and so I was working at this bookstore full time, and then went to graduate school and had thought I was leaving the bookstore, but then ended up kind of moving back home after graduate school and still wasn't totally sure career-wise what I was doing. But because I had built up a relationship with this bookstore, and luckily it's a lot of other kind of creative artsy people, and they were understanding that, you know, we were all individually working on a lot of different projects of our own. So I just sort of tried to figure out how to balance the bookstore, kind of working it part-time. I would work a few days a week, and then I would do different projects different times of the week. And we just kind of worked out a schedule so that I could kind of get to where I needed to be and then still work and get a regular paycheck, which, you know, doing the work that I'm doing, it's extremely gig-based, just like a lot of people are. When you're putting a show on, you hope some things sell, but nothing's ever guaranteed. So having some sort of regular paycheck for a really long time, and still, I mean, to some extent, I do feel like if I was being realistic, I do still, you know, would value having some sort of regular kind of income like that. It would be nice. The bookstore, unfortunately, is closed right now, so I'm trying to kind of figure out, like everybody else, how to kind of make ends meet in the moment. But it sort of helps you to evaluate what balance you need in order to kind of have that daily schedule. And what's funny about it, actually, for me, aside from finances and everything, though, is that I realized that I wasn't actually any more productive when I wasn't working that job. I needed a little bit of that structure. So if I knew I needed to be into work on Monday, then I needed to do my Young Space work on Tuesday when I wasn't scheduled there. And then I would crank out a whole bunch of really good work. So it's just kind of depends on your style as well. But I definitely relied on that for a really long time, and, you know, was really fortunate in a way to have a boss who was really understanding as well a few times when I'm like, I need to go to LA now, you know, to do a project. But I would never have been able to get anything off the ground without having had that balance for quite a while there.
Yeah, that sort of leads into another question I had, which is about, like, you know, you probably expected it, but how is this whole thing, you know, the pandemic, how has it affected your life, your practice?
It's been really strange, actually. Unexpectedly, personally, probably really good for business in a strange way. But I wasn't really sure, and still am not, like, I guess what the long-term implications of it are. I think it's kind of a short-term boost for me, particularly in like a way that I don't think is necessarily great. You know, it's just that I feel like, well, yesterday, for example, was the deadline for the most recent open call for a virtual show. And it was double the submissions that I normally get. So it's like hundreds of artists submitting, and it's a lot of students, which it typically is, because they're trying to get their work seen by, I usually co-curate with another arts professional. So, you know, they're getting their work in front of eyes of someone else, and then it can theoretically lead to other projects. But I just was completely, my brain just exploded yesterday when these submissions were coming in. And, you know, for me personally, it's really exciting, but it's also kind of annoying because it's only happening because there's this bottleneck right now of this kind of, you know, there just aren't that many opportunities to show work right now. And a lot of students' degree shows were canceled or postponed, and they don't know what's happening, or they can't make work in their studios right now. So they're just trying to get their work out however they possibly can. So I'm really glad that I can kind of be able to provide at least one kind of platform to try to do that. But on the flip side, in a general way, it's frustrating that it's happening at all, you know, and that I kind of think that we're going to have to return to some sort of balance. But it's interesting to have been running essentially a virtual platform already, because it's something that's established that can be really beneficial. So kind of right now trying to figure out how to kind of make it, or continue it, you know, being meaningful, but kind of make it a bit more, I don't know, now's the time to experiment, make it better. How can I kind of expand on what I'm already doing?
Yeah, totally. I mean, obviously open calls are one way, but what are some other ways, you know, graduating seniors can approach you, or online galleries like yours? What are some do's and don'ts of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think a lot of it, you know, just like with, you know, any kind of networking, or personalities are always a little different. So some people are totally okay with something, and then somebody else is like, oh, why are you talking to me? You know, so you don't really know. But the thing is, you don't really know until you try. So, you know, what the worst that's going to happen is somebody's going to just probably ignore you. But I still think, you know, I guess in a way, going back to Instagram, especially as a student, you know, still having a website is really, really important, hugely important. And I don't think that it makes sense to just have an Instagram account, but having both of those is really powerful, because you can really socialize with people and connect very easily on Instagram, but then can still point people to your work on your website and any exhibitions or projects that you have going on right now. But that the ability, I guess, to be on social media and just sort of gradually watching and keeping track of other projects that are going on, you can start to gradually get a feel for who is maybe showing work that's similar to what you're doing or what you like, places that your work might fit in with. And then it's just so easy to send somebody a message or an email. But I think the biggest thing to me personally anyway, but I've heard this from other people as well, is that it really goes a long way if you're sending kind of a cold call email to somebody or something, to have obviously done your research and really look into that project that that person is doing, or the initiative, because it is individuals running those projects. And so knowing that someone is reaching out to you, you know, interested in what you're doing and obviously wanting to show your work, but, you know, I'm an individual, for example, if somebody writes me an email and is like, hey guys, how's it going? I want to, you know, show you my work. Here's my portfolio with a link, but it's really personal, and they clearly didn't, you know, address me by name or even know who was running the platform, then I just kind of get the impression that they probably sent that email to like 50 people and I'm just going to overlook it. So if it's personal, it's just much more likely that somebody will pay attention to it. And that's just kind of the biggest, that's what's helped me too when I've reached out to other people also.
That's great. I do have a bunch more questions.
Yeah.
A few about like physical pop-up exhibitions, and a question about like what's the largest exhibition you've curated. So I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, like maybe some differences of physically organizing an exhibition. And I think that's kind of an interesting question, like the largest exhibition you've curated. Even online would be interesting, like the logistics of doing that online, like how many artists and
I think the online shows are obviously maybe it's more of like a data logistic thing. You're just kind of organizing a lot of different information. But I think that the kind of comparison or dialogue between online shows and physical shows is really interesting because it's I still will ultimately forever prefer doing a physical show, I think, because it's just obviously I really just want to be with the artwork in person, and so would everybody else in an ideal world. But the ability to share it and make it accessible with everybody around the world, that was the thing that I guess I grasped onto really early. Because the physical show that I did that was the biggest was a show at Standard Projects, which is a 2-story old mid-century police station, but it's in a village of like 2,800 people in the middle of Wisconsin. So nobody can get there really. And so we had a few people, you know, from Chicago, Milwaukee area come up, and we had a really amazing opening and things. But obviously I'm sharing this information with, and the work, the artists, they were showing, most of them were not from the Midwest. They were from the coasts. There were a few people from the UK. So like there were a lot of different artworks in there, but a lot of them were big. And we took up 2 full stories of this complex, and it was an amazing show. But it was just the amount of packaging. We were shipping like FedEx freight paintings, you know, back to New York. I mean, it was just, the cost was insane, and we were all really, really happy with it. But I think that was kind of the moment when I realized there's a balance between doing something that, at least from like an independent DIY perspective, doing something that's that ambitious can only really happen every once in a while, because otherwise you're just going to be in like massive debt and so exhausted. And like, why are you doing it? So balancing that with putting it online though, is that means that, say, an artist working in some crazy huge installation format in Japan can still share their work in an like curated context, and nobody needs to ship anything anywhere, and the work can still technically be for sale. You know, thousands of people can see it in some way. So they won't experience it in the same way, but just that accessibility aspect of it has always been really interesting to me. But the thing about the virtual exhibitions too is that there's really no limit on how many people you can have in there, how many artworks by any given artist you can show. So the flexibility in terms of that is so great, because you don't have to deal with inventory physically coming to your location or anything. So it's been a nice way to kind of compare.
Do you have any advice of how to reach out to physical galleries to organize shows, curate shows? I know several students are interested, since their thesis shows are postponed, they're asking questions about, like, you know, I really want to do a pop-up exhibition somewhere. Like, do you have any advice about reaching out to galleries?
I think that especially if you're kind of a unified like group of people wanting to do a project, a lot of, I've realized that galleries are often quite receptive to having sort of little interim projects in between their regular programming, because it means that someone's using the space. It's getting people in their doors and interested in what they're doing. And they might not include it in their kind of formal program, but they're still happy to have people in there, especially if the project is sort of adjacent to what they're already presenting. So it's a way for them to potentially find out about artists as well, and kind of get an idea without having to really do any work themselves, getting, you know, a good kind of read on what people are maybe interested in turning up for. But especially like other, you know, if there's spaces run by groups of artists, cooperative spaces, a lot of times they're, you know, they'll try to like work with you to put things into their regular schedule. It depends on the format of the gallery, because a lot of them will accept open submissions, or they'll have open calls as well. But then there's some that are just a bit more kind of closed door, like we don't look at anything. And they'll probably just ignore any proposal that you do. But I think, again, it's like you can kind of get an idea from other artists, potentially, the more you talk to people and pay attention to galleries' social media presences as well. The more engaged those galleries are on social media, the easier they are to reach out to usually and open to ideas. So it just, again, kind of depends on the gallery. But typically I've really been met with generally quite a lot of openness in terms of just at least talking about ideas. And if it doesn't work for them, they might have somebody else they can refer you to that they know would be a good fit. So yeah, it's kind of just networking again. Yeah.
Ethan is wondering, could you talk about your writing and experience as an art historian, and maybe how it plays a role in the success of your work online?
Yeah, you know, that's actually a good question, because I don't, I think consciously, I don't really think about my art history background very much, because I'm not sitting there writing research papers or submitting, you know, proposals to things that really to me are kind of like art history in this kind of capital letter sense. But I think so much of what I was doing in terms of studying art history has just really kind of influenced and informed everything that I've done, the way that I look at it. I still feel like that's how, you know, from an art history context is kind of how I'm writing up essays for, you know, any exhibition that I do. You're always kind of pulling all of these facts and ideas and different relationships that have happened previously into how this particular show or project or piece of artwork has come to be now. And that context is really interesting, and it continues a dialogue. So I think it's just like, to me, I've always kind of looked at it as like, you know, you're in grade school and you're studying math and you're like, when am I ever going to need to use algebra? You know, but then it's just there. And I think there's elements of it that pop up really unconsciously. And so I don't think of myself as an art historian, but without having had that background, there's so much kind of context that I just wouldn't have, that I think is very, very valuable in terms of how I formulate ideas and like to talk about it anyway. I think I had to kind of, again, maybe learn the rules before I sort of was like, nah, I'm going to discard that one. I'm going to bend this rule a little bit. And you just kind of, you get to know what the basics are and grow on that, and then figure out how you can use it in the way that makes sense for you, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I do have a few more questions, but given that we have like 15 more minutes, I wanted to give the students and staff and faculty who are here a chance. Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask? And maybe while I wait, I'll see what's left for questions I need to.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Kate?
I have a question.
Oh.
Yeah, hi.
So you started your Instagram Young Space. That's the Young Space on Instagram.
Yep.
How did you go about getting people's artwork on there?
Oh, I just shared what I wanted to share, I guess. I think that was the strange thing. Are you talking kind of like in terms of, you know, getting permission from people or application?
Did you get permission, or you just showed their artwork?
I pretty much just showed it. I think in the very beginning, I think I did, because I was still learning so much at the time. I didn't know most of these artists. And so that was, when I think about it, I was really just kind of like, oh my gosh, I don't actually know what I'm doing. I'm just sharing artwork I think I like, and I don't know who any of these people are. And I also wasn't totally sure what the etiquette was in terms of resharing work. Social media is really funny because it's so informal. That there's kind of this idea like, do you need to ask somebody to repost their work if they've already posted it themselves on this big public platform? But then also, you know, if it's applied with, if people messaged me and would be like, can you share my artwork? And I'd have to say yes or no. And what is my criteria for that? But for the most part, I would just, if I was say at like an art fair, I always go down to Expo Chicago, is their huge international art fair in Chicago. And I would just go take images of paintings that I would see in the booths. And the thing is, I guess they're trying to sell those works, so they really love when it's shared. So in that case, it was like, you don't really typically need to ask permission. I think I would ask permission from institutions every once in a while if they had anything that I thought could potentially be copyrighted in terms of text or anything like that. But for the most part, I guess just in general, the etiquette on Instagram especially has just kind of been, you can repost and share anything that you want as long as you basically credit who made it and that they can find out whose work that is, because it's generally viewed as a promotional tool. So the more it's shared, that's actually really good. And in all the years I've done that, I've never shared a post that anybody was like, oh, can you please take that down? Almost everybody's posting it because they're also wanting that to be viewed more, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
Denali is asking, how often do you do calls for work?
At least 4 times a year. I've kind of started to build a bit of a structure. The Young Space one has kind of a seasonal online exhibition, but then occasionally there's an extra 1 or 2 because I'll do a collaborative project. For example, in January, I teamed up with a group or an initiative called Far by Wide in New York City. And they do, it's kind of a fundraising opportunity. So what they do is we have work in an exhibition, but any work that sells, 50% goes to a nonprofit of the artist's choosing, and then 50% goes to the artist. And so I teamed up with that to benefit an organization called Art Start in New York City. And so we had a big open call for that. And that was a physical exhibition at a gallery called Ortega y Gasset. And that was huge. I think it's just kind of depends on where it's at. So New York City is always a pretty popular destination. So artists are usually applying, but that was one of those things that was kind of a one-time really cool collaboration. So that was an extra one. So I'd say overall there's maybe like at least 4, maybe 5 or 6 each year, but kind of just also depends on logistically what I can personally handle doing sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel like that kind of rhythm is good both for you, but also like, you know, artists, like what they kind of, I guess my question is like, is there too much for people to absorb, you know, as content?
I think that there is, I'm not totally sure what that like boundary is when you get to too much, but I'm aware that there is a boundary. And I'm always kind of worried about like, I don't want to do too many things simultaneously. I guess that's my biggest challenge. And also I'm one person kind of logistically trying to organize information. So if I feel like it's confusing, then it's definitely confusing for other people who are only ever getting little bits of information here and there. But I think that was the importance of establishing a structure of kind of seasonal shows as well, because I've realized that the longer those have gone on and artists become aware that they happen on a fairly regular schedule, they might be working on a body of work right now, but they're not ready. But if they know that another one's coming up, they'll save it for that next opportunity. Or maybe there's an arts professional or a gallerist who is kind of co-curating one in particular, and they really want their work seen by that particular juror, they'll apply to that show. So just kind of having some sort of structure, I feel like is helpful in terms of planning, both for me, but also anybody who's kind of following the platforms. At least you can kind of get some rhythm going, which is important, I think.
Yeah, we got a really good question. Do you have any recommendations for other online galleries or maybe even other artists who are responding to what's happening?
There are, well, actually, I mean, there's a lot, but there's one, it's not actually a gallery. It's called Artist Support Pledge. Have you heard of that at all? Mm-hmm. And that's run by artists. It was started in the UK, but it was kind of in response to the pandemic, and artists in particular, a lot of lost opportunities for exhibitions and things. But it's essentially kind of a fundraising, campaign. But the work being shown, that these artists are doing through this hashtag Artist Support Pledge, it's purchasable, it's really affordable artwork. So it's exciting if you are in a position to kind of purchase small works at the moment, but a lot of it's really kind of exciting as well. But I put together a resource document through Young Space, which is just one of many that were put together, but it was just called Distantly Together. And it's just a big resource document of exhibitions, open calls, fundraising efforts, all kinds of things. And a lot of them are Instagram specific. But there are a number that, as kind of the weeks have gone on, they've started to become a bit more experimental, and these kind of cool zines have started to come out, or kind of web projects and interactive participatory projects as well. There's so many, because this is just all I do is look at these projects all the time. But that, and I can send you a link to that doc if you want it, but that's a really kind of awesome spot to go through because there's so many other compiled resources. So there's a ton of really awesome initiatives out there at the moment.
Yep, actually, Nathan just shared the link in the chat.
Oh, good. Oh, awesome. Very cool.
So we only have a few more minutes. I was wondering, you know, for art students especially, like this is a huge, like a huge change, like trying to, especially for seniors, not only study, learn, create like a at-home studio to create work, but you know, this expectation to kind of finish off their year, having this thesis show. Do you have any, I don't know, words of advice, inspirational, to help us keep going in the time like this?
You know what, the thing I'm telling myself all the time, and which is like sort of maddening but also the most comforting thing to me, is just that like we are all experiencing the same thing at the same time. And I think the best thing, and I've again said this to myself and been talking to so many artists recently about this too, is that it's a kind of a moment when like the pressure is different. It's just, it feels you're under pressure because you don't have your normal tools or resources. You still feel like you're under some sort of deadline. But on the flip side, the pressure is also off in a way because you don't have those tools. So you can use that time to really experiment or work with different materials than you've ever worked with before, try new things. You can maybe scale down, do things that are a little smaller, and it's okay because everybody gets why that's happening. And so that there isn't this kind of, you know, it's not a cop-out to do that. Like you can still be working really hard and doing really interesting things. It might just be a different shape than what you had initially imagined, and just trying to be flexible as much as possible with your thinking is probably the best, because it's so hard to plan really anything right now long term. So it's good to kind of think like, how can I just really utilize what I have to do the best with what I've got at the moment, because everybody's circumstances are slightly different. But that, yeah, just kind of in the back of my mind, always just being like, it's not just me. Like, you know, all my friends are going through this exact same struggle right now. And my teachers understand this as well. And like, we're, you know, it's, I think that the possibilities for like new conversations about this kind of time is really exciting. And I don't think the work needs to be about this at all. I mean, if you're really, really responding to it, that's one thing, but I think it is an opportunity to kind of just create some new conversations and experiment with some new materials if you want.
Yeah, that's what I've been telling the students that I've talked with so far, which is just like asking yourself, like, what do you have? What tools do you have? And what can you do with those tools?
Exactly.
And I've really been...
Best things, I was just thinking, like, I have a couple friends who are, you know, typically painting, but they're in studios that are quite communal, and so they can't get into their studios right now. But they're like, oh, I'm suddenly a video artist, you know, like just kind of using these media that they've maybe used and had access to because you've got your phone on you or whatever, but that you're just finding yourself in these different habits of making, and that just because you normally paint doesn't mean you can't make video art for a little while or something. So I think that that's really cool, because going ahead in, you know, long term, within a couple of years, you never know how that's going to influence maybe your paintings that you return to. But that those kind of ideas and flexibility is really cool.
Right. I mean, that's the thing that we do well, right? It's like we always adapt.
Exactly.
And that's a really crucial thing as an artist, you know, regardless of what's going on in the world.
Definitely. Huge. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Kate.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really fun.
Okay,
Very nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.